Hi! Today we're reading from Comstock, Commotion, The Story of the Territorial Enterprise by Lucius Beebe from 1954. This was written when Lucius Beebe was the editor and publisher with his life partner Charles Clegg of the Territorial Enterprise in Virginia City, Nevada. Now, you probably know that the writer Mark Twain used a pen name for all of his career. And since most of our viewers here are reasonably intelligent, you probably also know that Mark Twain's real name was Sam Clemens. Now, what you may not know is that Sam Clemens had a brother named Orion Clemens. And Orion was the only secretary of the Nevada Territory, and sometimes was acting governor of Nevada Territory. Now, this was before Nevada was a state. It was a territory, but it was much larger than the current state that we know now. But right around just after the California Gold Rush in '49, in the 1850s, gold and silver was being discovered in the Nevada mountains just outside of Reno and Carson City, Nevada, in incredible amounts, unparalleled even to this day, the amount of gold and specifically silver that was being pulled out of those mountains. So there was a lot of interest in the mid-19th century in making Nevada a state and really taming the Wild West of Nevada because, well, taxes. And so Mark Twain took this sort of call to adventure, if you will, and then still called Sam Clemens. He took this call to adventure and joined his brother in the Nevada Territory in the mid-19th century. And he, like most writers, even though he wasn't a writer at this point, he was still an artist type. Like a lot of creative types, he didn't really necessarily want to work really, really hard for a living. And, I can relate to that. That's why you find me here on YouTube. But all kidding aside, kind of, sort of, Mark, people were pulling incredible millions of dollars, even in the 1800s, millions of dollars out of the gold and silver mines in this part of Nevada Territory. And huge fortunes were being established at this time when Mark Twain and his brother Orion were out there. And, like William Randolph Hearst, well, his father started the Hearst family fortune in Virginia City, Nevada, as a miner and a mining boss. And other huge dynasties were being established at this time. Lots of money that would go on to make San Francisco the port city that it is today, or that it became, and then the huge metropolis that it is today. A lot of that was money coming straight out of the mines of Nevada. So there was a lot going on. It was certainly a boom town and certainly a boom area when Mark Twain came to when Sam Clemens came to town, let's say. And it was just called Virginia. Later would go on to be called Virginia City for the sake of clarity, so not as to confuse it with the state of Virginia. But it was called Virginia in his time. And it had a newspaper. The newspaper actually was not started in Virginia City, Nevada, but quickly moved to the central hub of the action of where all this mining was going on, and where this huge cosmopolitan city was rapidly being built. And it was naturally called the Territorial Enterprise. Makes sense. It was a territory, it wasn't a state, and boy, was there a ton of enterprise going on. So, Mark Twain tried his hand at being a miner, but then he realized that was actually even harder work than having, a quote-unquote regular job, even though these miners were some of the best paid laborers, certainly the best paid miners, most likely the best paid laborers in all the country at the time. They were making upwards of $5 a day, which was untold money for basically for manual labor of the time, right? In the 1850s. And Mark Twain didn't strike it rich in the literal sense, but he certainly did end up striking gold in the literary sense, if you will, when he took a job at the Territorial Enterprise, which was the newspaper based in Virginia City, but serving this whole region of the territory. Now, you can see a small artist depiction of the Territorial Enterprise here on this book called Mark Twain in Virginia City, Nevada. This book is a compendium mostly of writings that Mr. Twain did in his more famous work, Roughing It, which no true Twain scholar or Americana scholar would ever be without. It's a wonderful romp of his whole time at the beginning of his career in the Nevada Territory and the surrounding areas. And I go into all of this backstory to explain the significance of the Territorial Enterprise Territorial Enterprise newspaper. It was where Mark Twain first signed his name as Mark Twain. He entered Virginia City Sam Clemens, and he left Mark Twain. It's even said that while he was there drinking in the saloons of Virginia City, he heard an old miner spin this old yarn about jumping frogs in a nearby Calaveras County of California, and wrote it, and just happened to be literate and having his talent for writing, was able to write it down in a very amusing way and sell it and publish it. And that was his first big break after working at the Territorial Enterprise. So it was is a very historic part of American culture, Wild West culture, worldwide culture, because Mark Twain is beloved all around the world. And the newspaper went on after Mark Twain. Mark Twain was only there actually for a few years. The newspaper went on for at least 50 years beyond after Mark Twain left. And Mark Twain would come back from time to time and lend his pen here or there, or they'd reprint some of his columns, or they'd, feature and highlight when he'd come back into town. But it went on as a daily newspaper for almost 50 years after Mark Twain left, servicing Virginia City, Nevada. But as the town went from boomtown to bus town to eventual ghost town, there wasn't as much of a need for a daily newspaper anymore. And after that, right around the 1910s to 1920s, depending on where you want to specifically cut it off, certain scholars cut it off in 1916, some cut it off in the mid-20s. But basically, post the 1900s, the Territorial Enterprise just really was a shell of what it once was. So that brings us up to the beginning of where we're going to pick up in this book here. We're going to read the very last chapter, which chronicles the resurrection of the Territorial Enterprise. And this took place in the in 1952 through the 1960s. And Lucius Beebe and his partner Charles Clegg are central to the resurrection of this storied newspaper and turning it actually into, for then, a modern weekly newspaper. And they got it syndicated across the country, and even they had subscribers internationally. So they brought it into the 20th century with a big bang, and Lucius channeled Mark Twain in a wonderful way with his irreverent humor and wonderful turns of phrases that we're going to enjoy right here. So that's enough of me yapping here. Let's turn it over to Lucius. Here we go. Coda in boldface. The Territorial Enterprise awoke from a long sleep in 1951. To the casual eye, its sleep had been practically indistinguishable from death, but the authors of its reactivation thought they detected in its still magic's name some traces of a vital pulse. The International Hotel and the Virginia and Truckee Railroad were gone beyond all recall, because their being had been altogether tangible. And once their properties were vanished, they were forever with yesterday. But the Territorial Enterprise was at once a name, a legend, and an impulse of vitality in whose economy presses and ink were incidentals that could be supplied, and shortly were. From the time of its suspension as an active and independent newspaper property in 1916, the Territorial Enterprise had existed in a state of suspended animation in other Comstock newspapers. As late as 1920, its name appeared in the standing matter of the Virginia Evening Chronicle, in the editorship of L. N. Clark. Its goodwill, subscription list, and advertising had been absorbed by the Chronicle, which was printed in a decrepit premises 6 doors down the street from the Enterprise's old stand. But its machinery and fixtures remained in their place, gathering rust and cobwebs as the years passed. The combined Evening Chronicle and the ghostly Enterprise limped wearily down the decades together until August 6, 1927, when Virginia City could no longer support a daily, and the Chronicle bade its predecessors move over in the graveyard, and itself crept quietly to rest. Comstockers are still able to evoke a mild indignation over the fate of the Chronicle's press and other mechanical resources, which were purchased by a well-heeled Montana rancher who happened to be passing through and set up 1,000 miles or so with a sign, away with a sign reading, "Original plant of the Virginia City Evening Chronicle." The place was Virginia City, Montana. The week following the demise of the Chronicle, its assets, including the name the Territorial Enterprise, were merged in the Monday budget, whose lifespan under J.T. Huling was less than 3 years. And then Vincent Nevin bought Huling out in the name of a weekly to be known as the Virginia City News. It is doubtful by this time if, in the disorder of their affairs, the various and successive heirs to the name of the Enterprise even realized it was part of their property. Until 1951, its name was discontinued altogether on the mastheads of the Budget and the News. But though a vein of ore had been lost at the head of the drift, it was nevertheless there for anyone who possessed the urge to follow it. And in the fall of 1951, the present proprietors of the property took an option in the Virginia City News, the weekly voice of Story County, with a circulation, at the most optimistic guess, of fewer than 200. The agreement called for them to take over active management of the paper from the Virginia Printing Company of Sparks, a suburb of Reno, the following May. The name, the Territorial Enterprise, after a lapse of 30 years while its files gathered dust in the libraries of the West, was at once reestablished on the editorial page masthead and the standing matter of the news, and specifically named among the assets of the paper in the agreement of its purchase. Minted gold changed hands for the name. The combined Territorial Enterprise and Virginia City News appeared on schedule May 2nd, 1952. Tabloid in form, 5 columns of 14-inch typeset on the page, the first issue established continuity with the old Enterprise, where it had left off in 1916, as Volume 98, Number 18. Its first issue was distributed in the dusk of a spring evening by Charlie Addis, by now dean of the town's characters and 78-year-old newsboy, who, 36 years before, had distributed the last copies of the Enterprise the night its presses fell silent, presumably forever. The masthead listed Charles Clegg and Lucius Beebe as sole owners in partnership, the former in the capacity of editor and the latter as publisher. Widespread publicity and generous editorial acclaim greeted the reappearance of one of the atmospheric properties of the Old West. From coast to coast, from the Oregonian, again, apologies, to the New York Herald Tribune, and from the Desert News to the New Orleans Times-Picayune. Editors searched the musty files and came up with editorials of welcome felicitation. All the while services carried extended stories and features, shortly began to flourish in the Sunday sections and national periodicals, and have never ceased. Almost alone, the Christian Science Monitor seemed to take a dim view of rebirth at Virginia City. Shots fired. Entirely aware of the uses of publicity, the owners of the Enterprise had prepared specially written and assembled package job releases aimed at the particular editorial preferences and economics of a number of important newspapers and magazines. Among them was a potential editorial page feature mailed to the Boston offices of the Christian Science Monitor, an organ notable for its good works and high spiritual tone. The feature aimed at the Monitor was sedulous in abatement of mention of Nevada institutions of which editors of the paper were sure not to approve. It dwelt lovingly upon Mark Twain and the Enterprise's fair repute as an agency of enlightenment and belles lettres. No mention was made of Virginia City's 20 flourishing saloons, or the circumstance of that paper's major source of revenue was gambling in Reno and Las Vegas. In most newspaper offices, where hundreds of such releases are received each mail, those unsuited to publication are relegated briskly to the wastebasket. Not so the Monitor. The story of the Enterprise's rise from the dead came back with practically the speed of light, with no comment but by airmail. The new tycoons of Nevada's Fleet Street thought they were able to detect on its margins marks where in the Monitor's offices it had been handled with fire tongs. On the Comstock itself, a substantial number of residents and businessmen were and still are determinedly indifferent to the existence of the Enterprise. There are in Virginia City a number of subscribers to the Indian religious rite of suttee, in which the widow follows her husband to the funeral pyre in a gesture of ultimate immolation, and a number of old-timers felt that the community should be allowed to dissolve into the final nothingness along with the fortunes of the mines that had brought it into being. The hand was impious that sought to stay communal suicide. Then, too, the newspaper itself was like nothing they had encountered among the miasmic Everglades of Nevada weekly journalism. The Enterprise didn't carry Dagwood or Popeye, and for reasons its own, obscure and possibly subversive, didn't devote extended front page space to the meetings of the Rebeccas. Furthermore, it had a formal editorial page, a pretension to grandeur indulged in by no other Nevada weekly, on which no patent medicine advertising was sold, and in whose columns actual opinions seemed to be expressed. This was obviously against God, as no other Nevada newspaper of any sort in recent years entertained an editorial idea other than that baby, mother, and the flag were good things, and that the public school system deserved the support of the taxpayers. Beyond this, dictates of prudence did not extend. Virginia City, with the few radiantly notable exceptions, flatly refused to take advertising space in the Enterprise, and its proprietors were forced to alter their overall approach to make the paper more of a weekly of the west of Nevada as a whole, rather than of the unresponsive Comstock. Things got off to a start after a fashion. There were initial misunderstandings. A news story in an early issue had occasion to speak fair words about the district attorney for Story County, and the next mail brought a demand couched in terms of legal outrage from the DA's law partner demanding a retraction, and that instanter. Since the mention had been altogether flattering and reflected nothing on the blameless reputation of the man of law, the Enterprise owners were surprised. Inquiry revealed that nobody had ever before had occasion to speak with anything even remotely approximating favor of the incumbent of the district attorney's office. It was with difficulty that the man of writs and injunctions was convinced that the mention hadn't been writ sarcastic. Virginia City in the mid-20th century is still the scene of low and joyous commotions, whose chronicling would raise the hair, like porcupines at doomsday, on the editorial heads in more inhibited newspaper offices. Its owners simply look to the past for precedent. A long tradition of outrage hasn't been wholly abated by devisings of property. Stabbings, embezzlements, defalcations, nose pasting, and the burning of powder are regular enough occurrences, especially in the summer months, to keep the columns of the Territorial Enterprise from too closely resembling the Christian Science Monitor. When a paragraph reported that the good ladies of the Altar Society of St. Mary's in the Mountains, having spent the evening in holy precincts mapping good works, unanimously sought refreshment after labor in the Skydesk Saloon, there was a tornado of protest from the good ladies. They hadn't gone to the sky deck at all. They had spent the shank of the evening at the old Capitol. When John Byrne, the night constable on duty outside the Sazerac, had emptied his gun after a fleeing carload of hot rodders bent on hurrahing the town, had succeeded only in shattering the front window of Greer's tea room and only narrowly missed maiming Olive Lane when she put her head out of the old Mr. Comstock bar to see what, quite literally, all the shooting was about. He was gently questioned about his marksmanship at the next meeting of the Board of Story County Supervisors. Had the night constable possibly been drinking while on duty? Since we got rid of the girls on the divide, what the hell else is there to do at night? Was the answer. Confronted with irrefutable logic, the commissioners hastily dropped the matter. By reason as much of their durability and the professional acquaintance with the outer world as by virtue the status of the Enterprise, its publisher and editor came to be an unofficial reception committee for the entertainment of distinguished visitors to the Comstock. If Cole Porter or Messmore Kendall or Sophie Tucker, Irving Berlin, Nunnally Johnson, Seymour Weiss, Dave Chasen, or Stanton Delaplane are in town, it is taken for granted that they are to lunch or dine at the Enterprise, with the Enterprise. Ward Morehouse, columnist for the New York World Telegram and Sun once drove directly to Virginia City from Jack and Charlie's in West 52nd Street to bring the publisher a firkin of fresh caviar, and thereafter made a practice of visiting Nevada for a week or so each summer. The moral tone of Virginia City is so low, it's one place in the world where I'm not conspicuous, he says. San Francisco's celebrated barrister, Jake Elrich, seldom misses an opportunity to invite the Enterprise to leave its professional duties and come across the street to the Delta. Luminaries of letters, Stuart Hallbrook, Oscar Lewis, Vincent Sheehan, and Roger Butterfield find company in the editors of the Comstock. Visiting magazine and newspaper writers by the score find latch string in its conventional place. Sometimes, their devotion to the entrance of the property leads the owners of the Enterprise into extended symposiums with visiting celebrities. One such, a while back, was Ralph Champion, head of the American Bureau of the London Daily Mirror, which boasts the largest circulation in the world. Champion arrived for lunch, and 3 days later was returned to his suite at the Riverside Hotel in Reno. That night, a holocaust of neuronic proportions, he's talking about Nero, neuronic proportions, destroyed a film theater directly across the street, and the next morning his hosts in Virginia City telephoned to ascertain if Champion had enjoyed the spectacle. "No, I didn't even get out of bed," deposed the slightly shop-worn journalist. "During the night I heard a vast amount of screaming and smashing of glass and ringing of bells and what sounded like the falling of walls and such. But after 3 evenings in Virginia City, I thought it was just part of your cheery American nightlife, so I turned over and went back to sleep." An Oregon lumberman, a friend of the publisher of the Enterprise, came to Virginia City to take a bride and was married in the press room, where coolers of wine had thoughtfully been placed on the folding delivery tables. He, too, remained 3 unforeseen days in Nevada, and the departure of the bridegroom from the balcony suite in the Silver Dollar was chronicled in the paper as being cheerful despite the heavy cast on a broken leg. His approach to the nuptial bower had been made in the judicious haste, and he had fallen the length of a flight of stairs. At one time, and briefly in the early days of the reactivation of the Enterprise, had a sort of tenuous bond of good works. Its general manager on part-time was also part-time sacristan of St. Mary's in the Mountains, Virginia City's notably beautiful and enduring Roman Catholic Church. The paper's finances were not as demanding of accountancy as they came to be later, and the petty cash drawer was conducted very much like the office cash compartment in the safe of Colonel Morse Henry Watterson of the Louisville Courier-Journal. Every afternoon, Watterson went across the street to the Louisville Jockey Club to test his theory that a bobtail flush can beat a pair of deuces when the wind and the chips are in the right direction. And to finance his researches, the colonel helped himself to whatever sum seemed appropriate for petty cash, a practice which, next morning, caused understandable grief and consternation amongst the auditors. Finally, the cashier prevailed upon the old gentleman to make out a requisition for whatever he abstracted. "It's your money, Colonel, but it's hard on the bookkeepers when they don't know what you've taken." Watterson assured him that in the future he would cooperate. The next morning, they found the cash box bare, and a slip from the owner announced in the amount he had taken. It read, "All!" exclamation point. A similar formality characterized the Enterprise office cash. Then, one day, during the progress of a Comstock blizzard, augmented by a snowstorm of bad checks, the man of ghostly offices disappeared, taking with him a substantial sums from the poor box and numerous holy artifacts. The Enterprise was amused, within the bounds of decorum, and headlined the story, "Miracle in Reverse Changes Church Funds into Thin Air." When the possibilities of an even more comprehensive miracle dawned upon them. The owners of the paper investigated their own petty cash department. As Colonel Watterson so aptly said, it was all. At the outset, the Enterprise had maintained editorial rooms in the premises of 24 South C Street, to which the paper had moved in 1863. Rented from Roy, quote, Buffalo Bill Shelter, their present owner, the paper had been printed at job plants in Reno. The finished papers were then brought up the hill, distributed locally, and mailed from the Virginia City Post Office. By the end of the first year, it was most apparent that this was not the solution to the paper's problems. Most Nevada weeklies, in order to survive at all, are of necessity family enterprises conducted on self-contained bases and only infrequently employing union mechanics. The cost of union labor throughout would close 9 out of 10 of them overnight, and the expense of publishing the Enterprise at a job plant removed by 50 round-trip miles from its editorial rooms was costing most of what the paper took in. The inconvenience of driving up and down to Reno for makeup and supervision was also a dismaying factor. The spring of 1953 saw the Enterprise embark on the costly and hazardous expedient of building its own plant in Virginia City. It was the first industry of consequence to return to the Comstock instead of leaving it in more than half a century. The last mine had sealed its shaft, the last mill fallen silent, and the sole industry of the community that was sluicing and gentling the tourist trade and selling it the Comstock passed. A completely modern stone and cement structure was built in the rear of the venerable Enterprise building, where it would not detract from C Street's almost unbroken facade of western false fronts. The necessary machinery was purchased from George Garcia and Harry Butler, San Francisco brokers in such matters. Typecases, stone space, and storage rooms were set up, and, not without serious misgivings, the owners prepared to manufacture their own product. The first issue of the paper was scheduled to be printed in the new Virginia City plant the last weekend in June. The museum piece press, linotype, folder, typecases, and other costly perishable items arrived from San Francisco aboard a monster truck before the roof on the building designed to house them. Before the roof was on the building designed to house them. So did the only solid week of snowfall the entire winter. The premises were dried out with blowtorches, and the first week or so were heated by bonfire in a steel barrel, which emitted, in Vesuvian quantities, smoke of peculiar acridity. When it was started, the press leaped into cyclonic action and snapped at about $1,000 worth of paper, which it happily tore into shreds while jumping up and down on its bed plates. The townsfolk who had gathered in glad anticipation of catastrophe were not disappointed, and slapped each other delightedly when the linotype squirted a stream of melted lead at the operator. There then was a static electricity, an elemental hazard which nobody had anticipated and even few had heard of. Paper stalks stuck together and refused to separate on the feeder, whole handfuls of it going down the guides and ending in shredded confusion in the machinery. The great steam press dementia of 1863 was recreated. Garcia and Butler made soothing motions, and an aged German necromancer arrived on the next plane from San Francisco. He was reputed to know all about static and hung the pony Michel with Christmas tree tinsel to beguile the evil spirits. It didn't work, and the power company sent sorcerers' apprentices to try mystic spells. The day the first run was scheduled and confusion had reached bedlamite proportions, the publisher and editor got to the shop in time to discover the Mergenthaler Merlin pouring boiling water from a tea kettle in a wide circle around the machinery on the theory that the steam would carry off the malevolent currents of electricity. It was then that the owners climbed on a plane and went to New Orleans, where they stayed drunk with drunk a week with Owen Brennan, not caring if the paper came out or not. As soon as they left the building, everything started to work like a charm and, generally speaking, has ever since. Staff members came and went with clock-like regularity, some hired away by deceitful rivals, others foundering in a sea of strong waters which perpetually ebbs and flows in C Street. On one occasion, the management hired a young man for the office of managing editor whose name was Clemens, and whom they intended for promotional purposes to fob off as a descendant of the original Sam. As had happened to the celebrated predecessor, but no relative, a strong east wind from the brewery smote him his first night on duty. He returned at dawn to the Silver Dollar Hotel, where he was, with difficulty, dissuaded by Florence Edwards, the proprietor, from tearing down the premises. He called that eminently respectable innkeeper a naughty name. "I'm not so old a bag," Florence said with dignity. "I'm a Bostonian and can prove it." The errant Clemens departed and drove his car to noisy destruction on the way down the mountain. Writers. The management of the Enterprise never made any pretense of immoderate temperance. Editorial conferences held daily at the Delta Saloon, or at the Delta, and the proprietors believed that their advertisers, many of whom are distillers of ardent spirits, deserve their personal patronage. The Denver Post saw fit to admonish the Enterprise to ways of virtue. This proved to be a mistake that would never have happened in the days of the Post's original owners, Fred Bonfils and Harry Tamman, either of whom could tell a coiled puff adder when they encountered one. Familiar as it was with the record of the Post from Gene Fowler's time, when it was edited by a staff vicariously located in Matty Silk's Bygone and Ed Chase's crooked gambling hell and saloon, the Enterprise editorially spat in the eye of the Post, with such a spitting that for some days to come, its distinguished general manager, Palmer Hoyt, was to be observed taking restoratives in the bar of the Brown Palace and muttering about the folly of fooling with bear traps. The editorial in the Enterprise read, "Look who's talking." Okay, and then it says, a quote from the editorial here. It says, "For 2 full generations now, both factually and metaphorically, the howling wonderment of the Queen City of Denver, the hilarious Denver Post, has swaggered happily throughout the saloons of Champa Street on the way to becoming one of the grand and gaudy institutions of the American West. Its first proprietors, the now legendary Henry Tamman and Fred Bonfils, first met in the bar of the elegantly upholstered Windsor Hotel on Larimer Street, where Tamman was head barkeep. Bonfils was a promoter of a lottery which narrow-minded folks sometimes remarked had suspicious aspects. Together, they formed a riotous partnership that rocked Denver's sedate publishing circles on its Congress gaiters and convulsed to the impious with indistinguishable laughter. By a synthesis of showmanship, blackmail, ballyhoo, and outrageous animal spirits, they ballooned the once sickly Post into a multi-million-dollar property. The Post incited the citizenry to civic tumult, which on one occasion required calling out the troops. Its staff members, Gene Fowler among others, were never noted for temperance leanings, and the entire atmosphere of the Post was one of unabashed alcoholic hooray. Its staff members had charge accounts at Jenny Rogers' Love Store, and the Post's personal and editorial conduct from the day Bon and Tam took over have been characterized by such screaming and bustling of plug hats as to become an epic of low and scandalous hilarity. The Post possessed a genius for chaos. This, then, is the tall tower of civic virtue that raises a disapproving eye in the direction of Virginia City and the Territorial Enterprise when Nevada's oldest newspaper asserts that culture and the humanities are strongly bonded in the cup that cheerses. The Enterprise, says the Post, with haughty sniffs, goes well out on a limb with the declaration that the consumption of liquor in its various forms has throughout recorded history has been the most reliable index of intelligence, gentility, and civilization generally. Having thus repudiated every flattering qualification that may apply to itself, the Post braces itself firmly against the mahogany and waves a palsied finger to admonish that it might be a sound notion for the Enterprise to come out of its alcoholic haze and to seek an answer in the time-honored question, whither are we drifting and whence are we bound? The spectacle of the Post, thus reaching metaphorically for the cloves and coffee beans before being helped to a cab by the waiters, is hilarious enough without further elaboration. But pause. It may be that with the passing of time and the corruption of its liver and other essentials, the Denver Post has been removed from its editorial rooms from the front parlor of Mattie Silk's Bygone on Holiday Street to the nearest YMCA. It may have issued a recall to its staff to vacate the Ship's Bar and the Brown Palace in favor of more refining precincts. Peek under those swinging doors and get a load of who's preaching temperance. Shortly thereafter, an item appeared in Abel Green's weekly Variety, the Bible of the entertainment world. Headline, Beebe on Skolsky. Quote, Gotham newspapermen are passing around the blistering editorial Lucius Beebe wrote in his Territorial Enterprise in Virginia City News, parenthetical, Nevada abbreviated, re Sidney Sokolsky. He took the columnist to task for having, quote, recently remarked in print without, as far as we know, provocation, that the publisher of the Territorial Enterprise was, at some unnamed date, involved in a fistfight in a Hollywood resort, quote, with patrons after making some insulting remarks. Whereupon Beebe made his points, denying having ever been, quote, in a quarrel, brawl, or altercation of any description in and around Hollywood or any Los Angeles restaurant, saloon, nightclub, or similar resort, end quote. The rest of it is very heated as regards Beebe's attitude towards Skolsky, certainly one of the strongest yet in recent years, especially about personalities in the show biz literati belt. Among other assets inherited by the latter proprietors of the Enterprise was a willingness to tangle with all and any comers, preferably those of exalted pretensions of good works or elevated public conduct. They have never subscribed to the notion that a newspaper's obligation is to the public, and Charles Clegg, its editor, has been known to be actively ill at the mention of the phrase public service. When I have a message, he says, quoting Humphrey Bogart, I send for Western Union. Such sentiments have reduced to a minimum invitation for the owners of the paper to address women's clubs, civic groups, and other allied agencies of right thinking. Instructors of schools of journalism and seminaries for the impressionable young take steps to prevent the Enterprise from the groves of suburban academy, but its stock in the continuous ascendancy among the impious contemporaries. The conduct of business in the Enterprise office, interrupted as it frequently is by excursions of the staff to the Delta, the Crystal for nutrition, is informal to a degree bewildering to wage slaves in more prudent establishments. On one occasion, Herb Cain, the ranking San Francisco columnist in the Examiner, was able to report that instead of the printed exhortations to think, which some employers distribute where the serfs can see them, the management of the Enterprise had strewn the editorial and business offices with cards advising the staff to smirk, sneer, conspire, plot, deceive, gloat, connive, leer, and defame. Bully, was Mr. Kane's comment. School of Journalism professors averted their gaze. As the year 1953 neared its end, it also approached the 95th anniversary of the cold and cheerless day in Mormon Station when its primal founders had pulled the first copy of Nevada's first newspaper from a frozen handpress, and the present inheritors of the name planned to observe the birthday. It isn't really our 95th birthday of continued operation, Clegg told the Associated Press. The paper existed, to be sure, for a number of years in a state of suspended animation, but that's a condition characteristic of its owner's part of the time too. I'd say the continuity was perfect. Messages of goodwill arrived in South C Street from President Eisenhower, elder statesman Bernard Barak, Nevada's Governor Charles Russell, William Randolph Hearst Jr., whose grandfather made the first of many fortunes in Virginia City, and other notables whose name made the news. The paper's owners, who frown upon annoying friends and advertisers for paid expressions of esteem on slight provocation, ran a 24-page paper rather than a huge and padded special and called it a day. They felt warm and good about things generally. The anniversary inspired feature articles in the Sunday editions of distantly separated as San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, and Manchester, New Hampshire. The Associated Press wired a picture story to all its feature subscriber, and the American Society for the State and Local History came through with a citation of merit for the Enterprise's contribution to the regional history of Nevada. The paper's old friend, the Oregonian, with Stuart Hallbrook at the editorial fonts, joined the Here's How chorus. The headline, The Voice of the Comstock. In the lively ghost town of Virginia City, Nevada, last week, the hardy citizenry were drinking toast to their famous newspaper, the Territorial Enterprise, which had just passed its 95th milestone. While the mails brought birthday congratulations from President Eisenhower and many another, including Bernard Barak, who in younger days was a prospector in Nevada. To the felicitations, the Oregonian is happy to add its own, along with the wishes of another 95. For almost 2 years now, the Enterprise has been a rambunctious, though always well-written, weekly that doubtless has given its hometown more fetching publicity than has been the case with much larger cities and newspapers, a condition of affairs that came about when Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg took over the obsolete journal and took it into a clearly seductive voice, singing the Comstock's current wonders and reminding readers of its stormy and elegant past. The Enterprise knows well that Virginia City cannot exist save by the bounty of visitors. To entice them, the paper devotes its every effort, not by conventional boosterism, but by reporting faithfully every homely event in the region and winning run at roulette at the Delta Saloon, and then suddenly the sudden departure of a prominent citizen in a blizzard of bad checks, and the deplorable theft of a fine electric sign on the premise of a suburban bordello. That is the kind of advertising is effective has become increasingly clear. During the past season, the town was constantly overrun by happy visitors who wanted to see firsthand a community as different as possible from their own. They came from 48 states and several foreign countries. They came from 48 states and several foreign countries was no surprise to the circulation manager of the Enterprise, who has sworn before the Audit Bureau of Circulation, ABC, that the subscribers not only are legion, but are to be found in most parts of the known world. End quote. The continuity which has been established between the territorial enterprise of the mid-20th century and its ancestral property is more than superficial. Its proprietors are urgently aware of a heritage of what Bernard DeVoto calls, quote, being West, a heritage possessed of implications of spaciousness and individualism, either in partial or complete eclipse in less favored parts of the world. As it was in the days of Joe Goodman and Roland Daggett, it is perhaps at least formally conducted newspaper office in the land. The earliest chronicles of the Enterprise destinies were marked on the close affinity between the editorial policy and food and drink, so that a paid-up subscription was celebrated in early times with beefsteak, and a job print order with rejoicing among the pots. It requires today but the most microscopic provocation for all hands to shut up shop and repair to a tavern to celebrate a new advertising contract or other happy omen. It is not ascertainably true that the office manager, Mrs. Cecilia Andrews, and the managing editor, Fay Fuller, are unable to open the morning's mail until they have consulted the Oracle of Martini, but it is in the record that no major decision, either in editorial or business offer, is ever achieved without deliberation at the Delta. Subscribers are favorably impressed with the sources of almost every item of news in the columns of Dave the Peddler, the state correspondent, and the Mesdames Catherine Hillier and Catherine Best, who conduct, quote, Comstock vignettes. It all derives from saloons, so must be the true and veritable McCoy. In vino veritas. 3 generations of the Enterprise ago, its editors defined magnificently with the nabobs amidst the florid grandeurs of the Washoe Club and Lit Jockey Club cigars with the co-owners of everything in sight. Today's occasions for rejoicing, anniversaries, receptions to visiting notables, and milestones on the highway are observed with double magnums along the prudent thickets of potted palms in the Comstock house, or with the roast young kid or suckling pig run up at the Delta restaurant by 4-Day Jack Sonora, a chef who has not heard of Gaylord Hauser. Jack refers to the impending entree of releve as, quote, merchandise. "Look, the fine merchandise," he exclaims, displaying a roasting goat, horns and all, and ready for the oven, among the palsied drinkers at the bar. "Is enough for 6, he says with satisfaction. Weighs 30 pounds. Visiting editors from shops where there are time clocks and where sleeping under desks in the daytime is discouraged stroke their chins thoughtfully upon encountering the Enterprise in its native setting. As it heads into the home stretch for a century mark, as an institution of the West, the Territorial Enterprise is Nevada's largest weekly and easily the best-known newspaper in the Silver State. It is also, by audit of the Audit Bureau of Circulations, ABC, the accepted agency of rating for American newspapers, the largest weekly in the western states of California, Utah, Arizona, Idaho, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Montana. It finds itself universally quoted, envied, and in some cases, abundantly hated. Newsweek remarked of it, quote, "In all the world, there isn't a newspaper even remotely resembling the Territorial Enterprise. Its proprietors in the 20th century are content with this estimate." And that ends Comstock Commotion, the story of the Territorial Enterprise. That ends this book. Now, mind you, this is the last chapter. And the paper had only been they bought it in 51, but it had only been operating since 52. This book came out in 54. This has been almost probably less than 2 years of operation, and all that had happened in those 2 years. So the paper went on until the late 60s. Mr. Beebe, who we see here, and his partner Charles Clegg sold out their interests. Sources vary on this, but it's within a year of 1960, whether that's plus or minus. It just depends on who you ask, and it depends on the source. But regardless, they went on for at least another 5 to 6 years as editor and publisher of the Territorial Enterprise, and then the Territorial Enterprise continued until after Beebe's death and him leaving. Beebe died in 1966. The paper continued shortly after that, but then unfortunately folded. But I just love reading about what I'm sure was such an exciting time of this sort of dream come true of Lucius Beebe, this dream come true of the town, of sort of vindicating this lost crown jewel of their days gone by. I wanted to just share with, I know we've been going for almost an hour here. This is probably going to be our longest video. So thank you if you are still here watching and listening. As a treat, I'd just love to show you a crown jewel of one of my collections, which is a signed letter typed by Lucius Beebe on Territorial Enterprise masthead and signed. And this was purchased in an antique store on C Street in Virginia City, Nevada, across the street, catty corner from the street from where the Territorial Enterprise building was in Lucius Beebe's day, and just a few doors down from where the Territorial Enterprise was in Mark Twain's day. It did move around a little bit in town. This is from toward the very end of their career. I have read plenty in this video, so I will read this at another time for another much shorter video, but I just think it's really cool. This is from 1959, and depending on who you're talking to, this was either the last year that they were as hands-on involved in the paper, or 1 year before their departure. And it's a really cool letter. I look forward to sharing it with you, but the fact that it's got his signature, it's on Territorial Enterprise masthead, it references Mr. Beebe and Mr. Clegg right here, and the fact that I was able to purchase it from one of my favorite antique stores in the world, right there on C Street in Virginia City, Nevada, from a very noted Virginia City and surrounding area historian, Miss Janice Oberon. If I pronounce your name wrong, please forgive me. She's written many books on Reno and the Virginia City and the surrounding areas. And I was able to purchase it from her booth there in the antique store in Virginia City, Nevada. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you, a cool little artifact there. So thank you so much for listening to this really eventful chapter in Lucius Beebe's history, America's history, journalism history, and of course, Virginia City, Nevada history. If you enjoyed any of these subjects touched on today, go ahead and like and subscribe, because you know there's more coming. We'll be reading more about more from this book specifically, more about Virginia City, Nevada, more about Mr. Beebe, more about Mark Twain, more about the Wild West and beyond, and Lucius's really unique take on it. So go ahead, like, subscribe, so that you can be notified of any of those subjects as we record them and post them. If you have any requests of things that you'd like us to read from Mr. Beebe, go ahead and put them in the comments. Let us know. Happy to take requests. And go ahead and check out in our description there, we've got links to some of the books mentioned here, whether that's by Mr. Beebe or Mr. Twain. So thank you so much, and I look forward to reading with you next time.